So they paid.
They have to pay.
Wow.
You have no choice. Do you want to be down for 6 weeks?
Most people are just like, out of the question, we're not paying.
As a business, we have backups, right? So when we get breached or hacked, we just restore from backups. What's the big deal?
Well, then you don't have a plan.
The reason that you're seeing so much ransomware is because it's successful. Their clients and customers wanted to pay the ransom, so you put them in a bad situation and they have no choice.
If you have a plan and it doesn't exist except in digital form and you've lost access to digital access.
If you're not using AI to help you, then you're doing it wrong.
Let me go get my soapbox to stand on here. You can count on an incident on Christmas Eve and New Year's and Super Bowl Sunday.
In many cases, it's a very large payment for potentially just a text file with gibberish in it.
You can almost count on an incident because they know everybody's at home. Well, unfortunately, all the threat actors know that. And that is really one of their primary targets during an incident. At the beginning, it was just the ransomware, and then it became the double extortion, where it was ransomware and I have your backups. And now it's almost triple extortion. It's ransomware, I have all your data, I'm going to release your data unless you pay me.
Wow.
And so there's this evolution of extortion that's been going on.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. We're back. We're dusting off the cobwebs. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Nicholas Blank.
Hello, Chris. It's lovely to be back in the studio with you. And before we carry on, I'd like everyone who's watching this to please move that mouse button or your finger down to the subscribe button, because it really does help the channel grow. And we need your help to do that. And Chris, I'm delighted to be back in studio today, as I said, and you have got a cracking set of guests for us talking about a very interesting topic.
Yeah, look, it's always, we like to talk about interesting topics here, and we're super excited to welcome back Ernie Anderson. Ernie, I think, was a guest back, I want to say episode 58, Ernie. It was around about that time, probably 2-3 years ago. So thank you very much for coming back again. Not sure if you want to just quickly introduce yourself before we move on to Darryl.
Yeah, no, it has been a while and it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you guys inviting me back. So I'm excited to be here. Yeah, introduction. So, career consultant, spent all my time focused on cybersecurity. Last time you guys met with me, I was with another firm, and since then I actually started my own company, TBDCyber. I've got a partner, a guy Graham Payne, who started it with me. We've been having a heck of a lot of fun over the last. We're coming up on 2 years now. We're focused primarily on advisory services, so really consulting and trying to understand what customer requirements are, and then figuring out what solutions are for that. And so, yeah, that's me. That's my big change over the last 3 years, which has been pretty exciting.
Well,
And we've been doing a lot of IR work, so this will be good to talk to you guys about it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, so and I think it's sort of a great pivot into today's topic, right? I want to talk a little bit about IR or incident response, and we're fortunate enough to have someone who kind of lives and breathes this stuff, right? And so, Darryl, welcome to the show. We're super excited to have you. And do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Hi, Chris. Hi, Nicholas. Thanks for having me. I'm Darryl Switzer. I lead our cyber resilience and incident response practice here at TBDCyber. I have about 15 or 20 years of incident response work, so lots of missed anniversaries and holidays and vacations. But it's work that I really like. It's work that is desperately needed, and not very many people are in the business of being hacked, if you will. And so even really smart people need help during incidents. And so it's a great job for me. I love it, and I love the excitement and the pace of it all.
And you mentioned missed anniversaries and birthdays. Yeah, the bad guys don't schedule, right? They don't work to our schedule, I guess, which is
Yeah, they kind of do. Like you can count on an incident on Christmas Eve and New Year's and Super Bowl Sunday in the United States. You can almost count on an incident because they know everybody's at home.
yeah, well, interesting actually. I think to sort of to kick us off, can we start at sort of the very basic, right? Like when we talk about the concept of incident response and or IR, what are we talking about here, and why is this such an important thing? I mean, we as a business we have backups, right? So when if we get breached or hacked, we just restore from backups. What's the big deal?
Well, unfortunately, all the threat actors know that, and that is really one of their primary targets during an incident. We've seen the evolution of really the ransomware is the big one. In the beginning, it was just the ransomware, and then it became the double extortion, where it was ransomware and I have your backups. And now it's almost triple extortion. It's ransomware, I have all your data. Even if you can restore, I'm going to release your data unless you pay me. And so there's this, evolution of extortion that's been going on. So it's never stops.
Wow. And so clearly there's a pattern afoot where we started off with single payload, if I want to call it that, and now we've got a triple threat. Do you see any other patterns from an incident response type of view? And I ask that because we've had guests on the show who've very explicitly talked about organized crime and so therefore organized activities. Can you comment on that?
Sure. When you say organized, Nicholas, it is really organized. It is a very well-run business now, and there are different entities as part of this ransomware as a service. You have your initial access brokers. Those are typically, the hoodie wearing hackers that you think of. They get access to an environment. They go onto the dark web. They sell that to somebody else. Somebody takes that access and goes to these ransomware as a service operators and basically signs up for a console. It's about $5,000, and you get a console that's as beautiful as any tool you've ever had. And you're able to create the payloads, distribute them, track what machines are and aren't hit. It's pretty amazing, and it's a well-run, very organized business. They pay commissions. I even had an incident one time where the decryption key didn't work, and the threat actors had a help desk that you could call to make sure the decryption key worked. It was sort of mind-blowing when I first saw it.
That's astounding, but how do you know about the consoles?
It's just the ransomware as a service. That's what it is. And so eventually they have built these infrastructures of either compromised machines or networks in places where law enforcement can't touch, and they're just like that. It's a dashboard. It's a SaaS offering now. You can sign up for it.
Wow.
And go to town wherever you like.
This has got to be something that's really profitable, right? Because they wouldn't continue down this path, and they wouldn't continue to make investments in this if it wasn't profitable for them. But something that's also, I think, sort of really starting to resonate and sink in is, and we've mentioned this before in the show, is it's really not a matter of if I'm going to have an incident within my organization. It's more about when I'm going to have an incident within my organization, right? And I guess IR is all about how do we prepare for that? Would that be a sort of a good way to summarize kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, certainly. Your information security budget, your budget that you have for security is always finite. Nobody has an unlimited budget. That budget goes way farther doing proactive activities, assessments against frameworks, vulnerability testing, penetration testing, those sort of things. Really, what we really would like to see, and the gold standard would be, yes, you're never going to prevent all incidents because of the humans, right? We're all the weak link. There's, if it comes down to it, you can't break through the firewall and you can't break through the network. It's the human through a phishing email to get access to a network. This happens in every organization. A lot of times it goes undetected, but the difference between a good and a bad incident is whether or not you're prepared. And so you can have events, but the preparation and the tools and capabilities that you have before the incident will definitely limit the impact. And so to your point earlier, Chris, the immutable backups, it's kind of a buzzword now, but it means what it means. Having backups where they can't be touched, so that you do have options other than paying. But the proactive work, the kind of work that Ernie and Graham do with companies to help them prepare prior to an incident, we've seen that a lot of times really limit the impact. Having a phishing email isn't the end of the world, but mishandling it is. Or, having a lost credential is not the end of the world, but mishandling it could be quite impactful.
So when you say mishandling, you mean having a process to respond or react to that situation. So if, for example, you're seeing, I don't know, a bunch of invalid login attempts in sign-in logs, right? When you say mishandling it, is it around understanding how to handle that situation and what to do in that instance? Or is it sort of more organized or more formal than that?
Yeah, what I see is that, in most organizations, there's 2 or 3 people that are really familiar with the incident response process and all the steps that they need to do. Unfortunately, during an incident, it involves the entire team. And so the mishandling it piece, what we like to do with our tabletop exercises and kind of the simulations we do with the executives and board level teams is helping everybody understand what's going to be expected of them during an incident. During the incident, if you have your application owners coming in and you're just now for the first time describing that you'll need logs for the last 90 days and you'll need this data or that data, it just slows everything down. So having your people trained, even though it's not their day job, of what their responsibilities may be during an incident is one of the biggest things that can help from the detection, containment, and recovery aspect is having a well-trained team, whether it's their day job or not.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you, have you had threat actors deliberately mislead or construe your response process while you are trying to evict them?
Yes, there are some stuff even on the internet where you can see that threat actors are part of a Teams meeting, and so the incident response team is
Yes.
in a meeting talking about their actions and talking about recovery steps, and the threat actor is sitting right in the meeting. So we've seen that. What I saw quite a bit in my last role was a lot of these threat actors are just they know how this business works. They know that we have cyber insurance, and oftentimes one of the very first searches that we see in Teams or through emails is cyber insurance. And what they want as threat actors, they want to see the policy, they want to see how much you're covered for, and not coincidentally, that's usually what they ask for. They know what you can afford. They do their research on the business that they have access to, and they know what they're asking for.
That's astounding.
Ernie, from your perspective, we know incident response is a thing, and it's something that is really, really important. But where does this sort of sit within the, I guess, the realm of a plan, right? If I'm an organization and I'm listening to this and I'm going, okay, well, maybe my security isn't quite where it needs to be. Like, where do I start? Do I want to be immediately spending money on having a retainer for someone to do IR, or should I be spending money on assessments or planning or all of these things? And what is your sort of advice as to how to tackle this very large problem?
It really comes down to the business size, like the different challenges, and I think it's the small to medium size really struggles with it because a lot of times they may not even have a security person, or they have like a security person that does everything, and there they've got very slim budgets and they're just trying to do the minimum to get by, and just the resources aren't there. The bigger companies, some of them are going to have multiple IR retainers just in case the first person is not responding fast enough, or breaches are happening in an industry with multiple other competitors that are tying up the same resources. So it's definitely approached differently based on the size. I think that's also going to affect how much resources you're putting into exercising that program. So like the bigger companies will actually have incident response teams, and then the smaller guys, not really. Again, it comes down to that guy who or gal who needs to deal with security. So I think at the very least, everywhere you need to think about it and think about what happens, and do you have some sort of plan? So do you have someone that you can call, that you can bring in? Do you have a firm that you have some relationship with? And at least that first call where you're like, wow, this is suspicious and I'm ready to go. And you can get someone in there to tell you and guide you. Then again, where your resources are, I think that depends on how much you exercise it, how much you bring internally, how in depth. But at the very least, you should think about it that if something happens, who am I going to call? And that could be even just your cyber insurance company. And, Darryl knows more about this, but they'll be able to vector you to companies that can do a containment. They'll navigate how it works with your policy. They can help you if you have a plan. And if you don't, you should just build a relationship with some vendor out there that can help guide you, regardless of your size.
Just to add on to Ernie, over the last maybe 5 years or so, even though it's near and dear to my heart, sometimes incident response retainers were a nice to have versus a want to have, and the retainer aspect, the guaranteed SLA, is really important nowadays. What we're seeing is, exchange vulnerabilities that impact millions of customers, and Log4j, and these kind of things that are just impact all companies. Good luck getting hold of somebody during one of those times if you don't have a retainer. And so Ernie and I have been at companies where we receive 20 or 30 calls in a day for a F5 firewall issue, and having that retainer and knowing that you have some kind of agreement where you're going to be able to get resources even though the whole world is on fire. That's a big difference in what I've seen with retainers in the last few years.
I think that's a really valid point, because just knowing who to call is very different from actually having the speed dial, right, and having some sort of arrangement, commercial arrangement, already in place and standing. Because the last thing you want to have to deal with, and I'm sure that most organizations, if someone calls you in the middle of the night, Darryl or Ernie, you're not going to go, hey, let's first sort out that statement of work before we help, right? You're going to jump in and help. But I'm sure there are, more rigorous or more old school type organizations who have been like, look, we don't have an arrangement with you right now, so we'll get someone to help you when we have someone available, type of thing, which is not a great answer.
I think both Chris and Darryl, you guys touched on two good things. So one, there is the issue about availability of resources and how quickly you respond. But I think, Chris, as a business owner now, the contract negotiation part is real. I mean, sure, we will help, but eventually we do need to get to a contract and we need to have terms and conditions in place. And it's better to have that pre-negotiated ahead of time. And a lot of times retainers don't have to be a huge, dollar commitment. I mean, they could be pretty low depending on the size, but you really want to have all that pre-negotiated. So when you're ready to go, you're not, thinking about terms and conditions and getting attorneys. Because as I think Darryl mentioned earlier about missing a lot of holidays, these things always happen on Fridays. They always happen on Thanksgiving. Like, it is breach time, and your attorneys don't want to get on the phone either to go negotiate those contracts. So sure, we'll get in and engage, but eventually, shortly after that, we need to get contractual pieces in place. And again, a lot of your network could be down, and attorneys might not be able to get to computers to negotiate these things. So that's why having at least thinking through, like, who am I going to call and who can help me? Like, it's good to know where the phone is and that you need to dial 911 or whatever appropriate in your country know what to do before you get there.
Yeah. So Darryl mentioned a little while ago that there are preventative frameworks and security frameworks that you want to ideally be following or have some level of success in to not see Darryl on a Friday night. Do you have a level of success that's based on any kind of particular security framework that customers can follow, or is it just that you want one and follow it rigorously, and it doesn't really matter which one it is as long as it is a framework of good repute?
Ernie would probably agree, maybe not, but from what I've seen out there, you obviously have your ISO and NIST and all these other frameworks that you can follow, and they all have either security operations or incident response sections. In most organizations, I don't see very many that are down the line a NIST organization or 100% ISO, down the line. A lot of times they're very custom, and so any other frameworks are better than none, if you ask me. But it comes down to the incident response lifecycle. The number one thing being the identification and detection. And so maybe 10 years ago when we were doing this, it was well over 200 days dwell time where attackers were in environments and stealing information or pivoting to other organizations. We don't see that as much now. The detection, the identification and detection is a little bit better, but no matter the framework, the incident response lifecycle is the same. Being able to identify, detect, being able to contain, being able to eradicate, take the bad guy or girl out of a thing, and then make sure that after this, it's a terrible thing to go through. Nobody wants to do it. It costs more money. It wasn't budgeted. But if you have to go through something like this, at least take advantage of it and do the things that you can do so that you can prevent this from ever happening again in your organization. It's a quite sad day, really, for me when I have repeat customers, that haven't followed advice and didn't close this or left that open, and it happens again. And that's probably the worst case scenario, is the multiple incidents back to back. We see that, there are some threat actors that, especially in the ransomware realm, that are really well known for re-attacking, right? I mean, they're criminals. You have to trust them to some extent to get the decryption key and that sort of stuff. But we have seen some of these organizations really do focus on re-attacks and doing the preventative measures, doing those things that led to the incident and closing those holes is probably one of the biggest things that you can take out of the incident. So that's a long-winded answer to your question of frameworks.
Great answer.
I don't care, as long as you have a plan for the incident.
How often are we updating these plans? You see this all the time in the consulting space, right? Is you engage with a customer, you spend all this time coming up with the perfect plan or strategy of some sort. You deliver that in a large document to them. It all goes down well, and then it just sits in a drawer, and no one looks at it again until either next year when the auditors come knocking, or some other sort of weird period of time. How often should we be updating these things? And sort of, is this something that is going to radically change constantly as threats and stuff evolve, or is this very much the plan is the plan, and the technology is separate, and the way we handle the incident is separate from just the actual plan?
In my experience, the plan usually doesn't survive the first contact with the enemy. There's a great general out there, and I think even the philosopher Mike Tyson said that as well.
That's right.
The first punch, and so all plans need to, they need to have some malleability within them so that, based on what happens, we can make changes. But in terms of updating the plan, I think a minimum of quarterly, we should be looking at it for the communication, roster and those sort of things. But what I've seen a lot of customers get value in is, there's a lot of news stories every day about companies being hacked and breached. And when it's relatable to you, if you're a aircraft parts company or something like that, and you see that happen to another organization, I think anytime you see that stuff in the news, you should think about your plan and what would you do if that happened. And then, minimum of quarterly, anytime you see something in the news that may be relevant to your company, but then also after any incident, we definitely need to get in there and update the plan, talk about what worked well, and make the appropriate changes.
One of the best things that even Darryl taught me was around there's the plan, right, that we need to get audited against. It's a lengthy document, fairly thick, and then this concept of battle cards. Talk about the battle cards, Darryl. Like, I thought that was a good concept. Really, the principles of like, this is really what you're going to pull out when the what hits the fan.
Yeah, going back in time, there was most companies had an incident response plan. Some didn't. Nowadays, everybody has an incident response plan. It's 16 to 32 pages. Like Ernie said, it passes every single audit. And then when an incident happens, nobody picks it up. It's not an operational document. I've seen a lot of playbooks and play cards, if they're called, and they're flow charts with lots of diagrams. And I often joke that if you can figure out where you're at in the incident right now, it's done. Those flow charts and stuff are a little bit difficult. What we like to create for people, and we've seen a lot of success in it, is this really battle cards, these play cards like Ernie's talking about, one-page documents. I've seen them laminated, hanging up in people's cubes before. One-page documents that describe our plan that we can, annotate as we go through the incident. If you're a pilot and you've had 10,000 flights, before every flight, you still pick up a checklist. And so most of us aren't in the business, like I said, of going through an incident every single week, and these plans can get rusty. And so having a checklist and having an operational document so that you don't miss steps, I talked about before, having one of these incidents is not the end of the world, but missing a step or mishandling it can be, especially on the litigation side. So these plans, these play cards that Ernie's talking about, just a lot of success, operational cards that somebody can pick up and run through and make sure we don't miss any steps, because these are crisis situations that demand calm leadership.
And Darryl, one thing that you highlighted that I want to reemphasize: print it. So print it. If it's on your desktop or if it's on a SharePoint site and you get into a ransomware situation, good chance you're not going to be able to get to it. So it should be accessible in somewhere that you can physically get to it, either at your house or in your home office, things like that.
The requirement in every framework to have it printed off offline, and for that reason.
I'm just thinking through this logically. The types of stuff that you would have in there would be, firstly, who are you going to call? Like, who do you call to engage to come and respond to this incident? But I imagine you've got to have other things in there as well, as far as communicating to legal or the media, possibly, right? If you like you mentioned, airplane parts manufacturer. Probably there's going to have to be some sort of media briefing at some point, right? And is that something, would that type of stuff be in the incident response plan, or does each sort of individual part of the organization have their own plan on how to handle these types of incidents? How does that come together?
Yeah, the communication and escalation piece of every plan is incredibly important. Depending on the size of the organization, over the last few years, what I've seen is typically we're bringing in outside counsel, because even our internal general counsel just especially this media relations. You have three different communications that need to go out. You have your internal team, which is important to communicate enough information to make them part of the team, which they are, but not over communicating to the internal team, because everything that's internal could end up on Twitter or Blue Sky in a moment. You have your external business partners, if you will, your third-party vendors that need to be communicated with, and then your customers. And so in all of the plans that we create, we work with internal general counsel, maybe their outside breach counsel if they already have one lined up, and kind of stage these notifications so that I've seen these take days. I create one, I send it off, somebody edits it, goes to the lawyer, it changes and comes back. Having a template for internal, external, and third-party vendor communications incredibly important. And again, to Nicholas's point, we see now that a lot of all of us have probably received this year multiple your data was lost in a breach, and a lot of the general public is becoming numb to it. But when you make a mistake, when you misspeak, when you say something, unfortunately with these incidents, what we see with all these leaders is, as a CEO or a COO of an organization, you typically you wouldn't make a decision without all the information. And during an incident, what these executive leaders are having to do is make decisions with not all the information, and then oftentimes the information changes right after we made a decision. And so it's difficult. What I've seen is, like I said, a lot of the outside breach counsel, these law firms that really specialize in breach work, they're really good at it. They're very helpful, and I would definitely lean on them during an incident.
Yeah, it's interesting how much you can tell about an organization based on how they respond to an incident, right? I think there are countless examples of, in the not too distant past of organizations who haven't done such a great job of it as well. I think right now, and I haven't been up to date this week, but I think there's been some pretty strong evidence to suggest that one of the cloud providers has been severely breached, but they haven't actually come out to acknowledge it. I don't know if you guys have been following the whole thing with Oracle and Oracle Cloud, which is very interesting, right? And I imagine the reputational damage of incorrectly responding could be almost worse than the damage of just the incident itself, right? If you deny, and then all of a sudden it gets proven that you have to, that there is an issue or what have you. So it's a very interesting situation for sure.
Getting breached is not going to always make customers run away, depending on who you are. I'm thinking of a password manager that everybody ran away from, but being breached is not the end of the world. It's the communication, right? And you lose that trust. In our tabletops, we like to talk about the brand, and a lot of times these decisions that people make, you can see the brand reputation, on a downward spiral, and that's because of the communication. Being as transparent as you can and as forthcoming with the information as you can is always the best thing. But like I said, Chris, we've seen this really take a bad turn for a lot of different clients.
Darryl, here's a question for you. What's your recommendation on when do you get attorneys involved? Because I think the communication plan is going to change depending on what you're allowed to say and like what they're driving. Because to your point, a lot of this stuff could implicate you, or you could say something you're not supposed to say. I mean, so I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like how early in the process do you involve the attorneys?
I feel like this old dog and new tricks thing, Ernie. So I used to be, I probably for my first 10 or 15 years of doing incident response, less than 10% of the incidents had an attorney involved in breach counsel. Over the last few years, we've seen how incredibly important this is, right? The everything that you do post incident, almost, it used to be really big incidents at really big companies resulted in a lot of litigation. I've seen graphs and charts from some of the law firms that I work with where now that's not the case. You can have a 10 user company or a 25 user company. No matter what happens, it's going to result in litigations and lawsuits, or even class action lawsuits we've seen from multiple states at the same time. I think now, just based on a few scars and experience, I think involving either internal counsel or especially outside breach counsel right away. The first indication that this could be an incident, or could be customer data or intellectual property at risk, involving the outside law firms are super important. You do not want all the emails, that we talk about during the incident that, hey, you left the front door open in the email. You don't want these emails discoverable because it just results in more litigation. And so having the outside breach counsel and having the entire investigation done under privilege is super important. And I think engaging them right away is probably the best path.
Darryl, I wanted to ask you, and you're engaging. So when the phone rings and it's you who has to pick up the phone, how much of your time do you spend cruising through logs and looking for causality versus managing politics and feelings, emotions, and putting out fires and performing the executive side of counsel and advising owners and shareholders? What is your mix?
In my role, a little bit of everything. Obviously, I have people way smarter than me that are looking at logs. That's kind of a depreciating skill, if you will. So I have some really smart people that are looking through logs and basically looking at the facts and developing timelines of activity. Most of my time is spent, just like you said, briefing executive leadership, briefing outside counsel on the current status of the investigation. That's where the majority of my time is spent during these investigations, is interfacing with the client's executive team, making sure we can get them restored and recovered and back to business as quickly as possible. And then a lot of work with counsel, developing reports. A lot of times there aren't reports because if there's no report, there's nothing to discover. Some incidents there are no reports, but working with them so that the reports basically give you a timeline of activity and stuff like that. So most of my time is spent with leadership and counsel, and then the rest of the team is working on logs and forensics.
And I want to piggyback off that question just a little bit. So we've talked a lot about the plan, but the plan is really just one small component of the IR process, right? Obviously, if I were to call you up, Ernie and Darrell, and say, hey, I'd like to engage you to help me with my incident response, I imagine there's obviously the planning phase of like, let's put together the incident response plan and what we do as part of that, which is communication and all of these things. But there's, I imagine, other parts of that, components of that as well, right? Making sure we have the correct log sources ingested, or what are the other parts of responding to an incident outside of the plan itself? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is an unfortunate reality in a lot of these incidents, is that when it's time, something's happened and we want to look at the logs or look at the evidence, it's just not there. And so the preparation, the kind of work that Ernie, Graham, and the rest of the team do on detections and being able to identify, making sure you have really good visibility, that's the part that's missing. I just had an incident the other day, business email compromise, and the first thing I noticed was that they didn't have logging on, and so there was nothing I could tell them about what happened, that led up because the logging was off, and it's not like it was something they paid for; it was just not turned on, and so. Doing that work ahead of time to make sure that you have the proper visibility, make sure you're gathering, collecting, storing, archiving the logs that you're going to need to look back. We talked about the dwell time a few minutes ago. It's not 200 or 300 days anymore because, frankly, the threat actors don't wait that long. We have smash and grab, we call them, where 15 minutes after they have access to the network, they're deploying ransomware, and some of them spend a week or two pilfering data out of the organization, so they have that data to extort you at the end. But doing that pre-work to make sure you have the visibility, to make sure you're collecting all the logs that you need to do, so that you have some hindsight and are able to really tell a timeline of what happened before I showed up on site.
So it sounds like there is a separation here between the preparation and the prep tasks, and then the actual. Okay, something's happened. We need to call Darryl, right? We want to make sure from an organization perspective, we're actually spending the time looking at the frameworks, making sure we have the correct logging enabled, making sure the logs go somewhere. Unfortunately, this is a big challenge in the M365 ecosystem, right? Because by default, if you don't do anything, you get 30 or 90 days. That's the logs that you get, right? And I've personally been involved with an incident where I've been able to track back until I ran out of logs, and then you're just like, well, I can't tell you anything more other than they've been here for 90 days because that's how long I can see them logging in for. So, so it sounds like again, I think this is a really small part, or the IR part is just a part of, an overall sort of, security, posture and management process, right? Sorry, Ernie, I feel like I cut you off there. You were going to say something.
No, I was going to ask, like, would it help for us to kind of walk through the life cycle of an incident, and you guys can ask questions along
Oh,
the
yes,
way?
please.
All right, yeah. Okay, so I'll start this one. So when we started the company TBDCyber, there was two things that I was trying to stay out of: managed services, just because there's a lot of vendors out there, and I just don't want to be a Me Too player, so we'd have to figure out what it looks like down the road. And the other one, incident response. It was like they always happen on the weekends, as we talked about, always with the holidays. I've got kids, minivan, all that stuff. I'm getting older, not my thing. But I knew as we grew, so we've got small customers, we've got big Fortune 200 customers. I knew in that middle section, eventually we'd get someone that would call me and needed help. So I needed to always have an answer. At the time, Darryl was not working at TBDCyber, but he was out there, and I knew he could always support us. So I had one customer who was kind of like the first security role at a company. And so, like I mentioned, like he's the first guy, he is the guy that's doing security. And when we did initial evaluations of what they had a plan, but it was the big plan that was audible, not necessarily actionable. And I knew if something happened, like I was going to get a call and I needed an answer. So sure enough, inopportune time, my business partner is getting married. I'm helping, or I'm at the wedding, and like an hour before, he's like, "Hey, I got this weird activity going on in our infrastructure AD." He's like, "I just need someone to poke around and look, and can we put settings back?" And I was like, yes, but I think you just had a heart attack or a stroke. So this is like a go to the ER and get the experts in here to just check you up to make sure everything's okay. So it's a Saturday. I called Darryl. I'm on the East Coast. Darryl's on the West Coast. So he's, it's probably like 7 a.m. for him on a Saturday. He literally answers the phone and says, "Hey, Ernie, there's only one reason why you're probably calling me." And I was like, "Yep."
Yeah.
And it was really cool because Darryl just swooped into action. And I'm not in the weeds as much with some of these things, but to watch him and his team go to work and just like, look here, do this, check that. Oh, they're already going to backups. It was really cool to watch. I mean, I felt bad for, obviously our customer was also a friend, but to watch him in action was great. So Darryl, you take over from here because I don't know what the heck happened to that, but you took it, ran with it.
That was the identification and detection. They knew something was wrong, which is half the battle. We talked a little bit about earlier, just backtracking a little bit, baselining your activity in your organization is another huge thing you could do to be prepared. When something bad like this happens, all of a sudden we start lifting up all the curtains and looking in all the dark corners, and we see all kinds of things. And a lot of times it's distracting. Like, what is that? Is that normal? And knowing what's normal in the environment is incredibly important. And I have to depend on the client. And most of these environments are net new to me. I have to depend on the client to tell me what's normal. So that was a little bit of a backtrack on baselining your environment so you know what's normal in the environment so you can pick up the bad stuff. After the identification and detection is really the containment, keep it from spreading. In this organization, I think Ernie's talking about, it was multiple business units or different organizations within this infrastructure, and looked like it was kind of in one section, and being able to contain that, whether it be pulling a plug or changing some routing. We have a lot of issues with these global customers that we have because there is no good way to cut the UK off from Australia, that sort of thing. So being able to contain, being able to keep it from getting any worse is one of the huge issues. Now with the ransomware, this eradication, right? Kicking the bad guy out of the network, that's one of the 4 questions that we always answer. How did they get in? What did they take and what did they look at? How do we know that they're not still in the environment? That's a really big one. And finally, what do we need to do to make sure this never happens again? And so that containment, eradication, getting them kicked out, incredibly important. With the ransomware, this restoration and recovery aspect of your business is incredibly important. Very much like the incident response plan. Everybody has a BCPDR plan. When a ransomware hits, there's no starting point in your BCPDR. Like you have nothing. And so understanding priorities of applications and data and connections to third parties, incredibly important. But this restoration and recovery, knowing that you can restore, knowing what to restore and in what order, so that you have the least amount of downtime, is the other huge part of this process. And then finally, the remediation. What changes do we need to make? What policies, procedures, tools, people do we need to make sure this never happens again? That's really the life cycle. And if it works right, that's the end of it, and it never goes back to the beginning again. But as we mentioned, it's almost impossible to stop every phishing email and keep every employee from clicking on links or doing things they shouldn't do. And so being able to detect when a security control has either failed or been violated is one of the biggest things in the beginning.
Darryl, there was a couple cool things that I think you did there, like right in the beginning, like just from a like tactical in the weeds. Like one, I think you communications paths. You were like, I'm not sure that we can trust our communications path, and they're not
Yes.
monitoring all our emails. So like you had to set up out of band like communications. I think was good. Other one was notify insurance. Then we actually did get attorneys. And then you guys like swooped in tactically of like to getting logs and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more around like, okay, there wasn't an IR retainer in place. We didn't have the baseline, but you were still able to go and be effective.
Yeah, a lot of these, the EDR tools, the endpoint detection and response tools, have really, 20 years ago when we started this and the phone rang, you grabbed your Pelican case and you got on a plane and you took off. And a day and a half or 2 days later, you're finally in the environment. These EDR tools, Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, all these tools have really made the difference. Almost, anecdotal, probably 90% of the activity these days is endpoints, right? Your laptop is the pivot into the environment. These EDR tools and the ability to collect historical data off of machines without collecting full disk images. We internally, we sort of have a joke, we have to really justify grabbing a full disk image these days, right? There's very few circumstances where you actually need that full disk. Oftentimes with the deployment of an EDR and 24/7 monitoring after the incident, we're able to pretty quickly gather the logs off the endpoints, gather the Chrome extensions or whatever forensic artifact are on the machine. The EDRs have really changed the game in this, and being able to contain way faster. I don't have to take a full disk image, which takes 3 or 4 hours to take, and then 3 or 4 hours to validate, and then 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, 12 hours to process, and then you can finally start analysis. And so these EDRs have really sped up the game and are really good at containing incidents.
It's a good point that you make there, because I was going to ask you the importance of tooling and just platforms in the environment, right? Because every vendor will tell you that you should buy their EDR platform and you should buy their SIEM and you should buy X, Y, Z of theirs. But it sounds like a lot of these are actually worthwhile having, and especially if you have something like an EDR that is collecting logging data from those endpoints and actually pushing it somewhere where you can actually get to it, right? It's a worthwhile enterprise, isn't it?
It really is, and it's even, there's actuarial data that backs this up. So just most recent job was kind of in the cyber insurance industry. They have the data that shows that not having RDP open to the internet reduces the number of claims. Having multi-factor authentication for access to external resources. There's a chart I've seen where the number of ransoms for this particular company dropped 60% on claims as soon as they mandated multi-factor authentication. The next evolution of this will be you have to have an EDR deployed and you have to have somebody monitoring it. That's the worst thing. We've all experienced this where a company goes and buys tools and stuff and nobody's managing it, nobody's watching it. So that 24/7 monitoring, I don't have a dog in the game here. And so as long as somebody's watching it, somebody has eyes on glass all the time, and you have your EDR tool deployed where it needs to be deployed, is probably one of we have to make it harder for the threat actors. And so having these tools in place makes the cost of hacking an organization high enough for threat actors that they'll go on to the next one. It's way easier. So put these tools in place, but more importantly, make sure they're monitored, tuned, and regularly updated.
I have noticed that the level of preparation when we've seen what happens during a breach, talking about the attackers now is just astounding. This is often not their first rodeo. They know exactly what they're going for. The tool set is very well prepared. Often getting to domain admins or global admins is a matter of minutes once they decide to launch. So the amount of skill level as well as the tool sets in place are often very evident that they're really, really high. Now, we've heard a lot in the news about nefarious AI or AI being abused for lots of reasons. And as part of your tool set, now, before there was AI, there was PowerShell and lots of automation frameworks that were being used by attackers to automate a whole raft of functions and simplify things. Is there something in your tool set that's changed significantly in terms of how you respond that makes use of something that you weren't using not even a year or two ago that you could talk about without giving the game away?
If you're not using AI to help you at least validate what you're doing, you're probably doing it wrong these days. And so in the terms of the process and gathering the information and doing the analysis, we have leveraged some AI to just make the efficiency, coming from the cyber insurance industry. That's one of the things that maybe the claims cares about more than anybody is, cost. And so when we go into an incident, a lot of times we know exactly how long it's going to take and that sort of thing. So we've used AI to obviously enhance our scripting and do more automation in the gathering of the information. But even in the proactive side, we're using AI in our tabletop simulations to build, videos and to build very compelling news reports and things like that. We're leveraging it in a lot of ways. The number one way is automation, getting the identification and detection faster and faster so that there's less dwell time. The proactive work, the stuff that Ernie and team are out there doing, the tabletops that we work on every day, we're using a lot of AI to develop those and to just make them more, everybody's probably been through a tabletop, it gets kind of boring, and we do them a little bit differently, much more interactive with the client, and then using AI to just develop injects and develop scenarios for the client. We're using a lot of that behind the scenes, obviously, for the forensics. We're leveraging it wherever we can.
When we first had Ernie on the podcast a couple of years ago, we had this great takeaway from him, which was stop buying stuff, right? And I still keep joking.
I still stick by that.
And we use that quote a lot.
We really do use that quote a lot. I actually think that we need to have that be a T-shirt. But I think we've just had another gold nugget from Darryl here, which is, if you're not using AI to help you, then you're doing it wrong. And I think that perfectly sort of summarizes the state of the industry at the moment, right? Is AI is everywhere, and it is good to have some help in where the efficiencies, where possible, or where it makes sense to do that.
I think kind of in the end of this is it comes down to pay or not pay. So you're ransomware. What are you seeing in the trends now? Because I think, I don't know. I hear like in some places it's illegal to actually make the payment. I would say in my the ones that I've seen, and I haven't seen as many as you, most people are just like, out of the question, we're not paying. And they just go to like, we're not even negotiating, or maybe they'll have a dialogue, but they're like, we're just going to backups and it is what it is. Let's get our systems back. What are you seeing? Like, what's the trend there? And like, I guess, how do you think through that? And if you decide to pay, how do you even pay? Like, how do you do it?
Let me go get my soapbox to stand on here. So the reason that you're seeing so much ransomware is because it's successful. When we're doing tabletop exercise, Ernie and I have been a mutual customer of ours from the past, very large law firm, executive level tabletop. Their data was released. Obviously, they took the stand of, we will not pay, we're not dealing with this person at all. Their clients and customers felt a little differently. Their clients and customers wanted to pay the ransom so that all this litigation and all these mergers and acquisition information wasn't released. And so you have the companies that, if you ask somebody right now, they would say no. But then if they woke up tomorrow and they had no backups and all of their systems were down, they don't leave them with a lot of options, especially large organizations. If they're rebuilding 20,000 machines or 10,000 servers. It's just impossible. And so they're
So they
forced.
paid.
They have to pay.
Wow.
You have no choice. Do you want to be down for 6 weeks or, maybe 6 days? And, like the state of North Carolina, it's against the law to pay a ransom. And so I've had universities and police departments and stuff like that in North Carolina that get ransomed, and it's frankly against the law in North Carolina to pay a ransom. And I kind of like what that state did in the U.S., which not only made it against the law, they also have basically a crash team. And so I was at a university, they were hit. The state will send a team of 10 or 15 people and 100 mobile Wi-Fi hotspots and all kinds of stuff to get them back up and running so that they don't pay. One thing that I did see recently, and it was eye-opening and not surprising, is that about 70% of the people that pay the ransom pay it because they have cyber insurance. And so it's a little bit of the cyber insurance, what you really need to have is kind of driving the payments because it's there. If it's going to get paid and I can get a key and it's covered by insurance, I can get all my data back. Why not do it? So we have this sort of, it's eating itself, if you will. I can't think of the right phrase, but that the cyber insurance industry is really, unfortunately, because you're covered, because paying the ransom is covered, it gets paid. And as Ernie said, most of these tabletops we do, the stance of the organizations is we wouldn't pay, and some of them won't even talk to the threat actor, but you put them in a bad situation and they have no choice. And so it's a big difference between tabletop exercise and real life. We just unfortunately see them paying. I think in the UK, though, they just passed another law in the UK that it's illegal to pay them. In the beginning, you couldn't pay them because they were in OFAC countries, the countries that you can't do business with, and especially in the US. The threat actors are smart enough to move their operations from, say, Russia to Estonia, and stuff like that,
Right.
where you could actually pay them. Yeah.
In the cases where folks do pay, are the keys? I mean, there's no honor amongst thieves, right? Are the keys trustworthy? Are they actually getting keys that work, or is it a matter of? I mean, it's many cases it's a very large payment for potentially just a text file with gibberish in it, right?
I would say in general, the keys work, and granted, they're criminals, and there is no honor, but they do want people to know that if you pay the ransom, you get a key that works. It doesn't always work on everything. We've seen organizations that got hit 3 times in a row. There was something open like a firewall, one of these F5 log4j things or something like that, where they got hit 3 times in a row. 3 different threat actors. They paid a threat actor for the decryption key. They decrypted it, and there sat more decrypted data. And so it got triple encrypted. And so they paid for the key, and it worked fine, but it still didn't give them their data. In general, yes, the keys work. I mentioned if it doesn't work, a lot of these, especially the well-known, kind of large ransomware operators, have help desk that you can call. They want the key to work, and they want the reputation that the key works. One thing that we have seen is, I mentioned the triple extortion, and so, I was able to recover, and I had backups, and you couldn't get to them, and now I'm up and running again. And then, obviously the threat actors, we always call it proof of life. They will oftentimes send a file tree of here's what I have, and they'll ask for payment, and they will promise to delete the data, and they'll even send you. I've seen videos. They'll send you back a video of here's your data getting deleted. They'll even some of them send certificates of destruction back to you, just like you would get from a real company. And then the FBI comes in, or Interpol, or one of these international organizations come in, they seize the servers, all that data is still sitting there. Ernie and I have a really large customer who had some data lost. They're all over the world. So this happened in a far off piece of the world. Data was lost. We went through the incident. We figured out where it came from and how the bad guy got it. Just recently, now more than a year later after the incident, that data was posted up again on the internet as if it was new. Unfortunately for this client, some of that data contained passwords and stuff, and of course people went into that data, tried those passwords, and some of them still work a year later. And so that's that missing aspect of the remediation to make sure this never happens again. But yeah, the keys work. Generally, they work. You have some problems with SQL servers and databases sometimes corrupted. Generally, the keys work, but to your point, you just really can't trust these people.
Wow, I think a lot to think about there, but I think probably one of the big lessons here is it's important to have a plan, and the plan doesn't just involve or entail knowing who to call. It's about having those conversations ahead of time to retainers, arrangements, resource availability, all of that type of stuff is kind of figured out, and obviously then doing the prep work up front, right? Making sure that you've got logs and data and things to be able to look back over, because you need to be able to figure out that there's an incident to begin with, right? Which I think is can be really challenging if you don't have the right things in your environment.
And to Ernie's point earlier, make it as practical as possible, because if you have a plan and it doesn't exist except in digital form, and you've lost access to digital access, well, then you don't have a plan.
I'd say the other thing is test it to some degree. So I'll give you an example. So one of my good friends, smaller company, right? So he's in the mid-size, smaller. They got ransomware. They decided they weren't going to pay, and then they realized someone had lost the key to their backups.
Oh.
So they've been doing backups, and it's been automated, but it was all programmed in and happening. And then when it actually came to do the restoration, they basically, DDoS ransomware themselves because they lost the key to the encryption of the backups. And so then they just had to rebuild from scratch. So if you're testing it and actually doing some level of restoration, you realize, oops, we're missing these pieces. So that's another good one as well. It's just, test it every once in a while to make sure it actually works, man.
Gentlemen, I want to be conscious of the time. Don't want to keep you any longer than you've committed to. I really appreciate you guys coming on. I guess before we let you go, I don't know if there's any final thoughts that you wanted to share or any sort of final tips. Are you happy to be found on social media or LinkedIn, places like that? Or you happy for folks to reach out to you?
Yeah, at least for me, mostly I'm on LinkedIn, so you can look up TBDCyber, Ernie Anderson. That's probably where we do most of our activity. I do think, well, first of all, we appreciate you guys having us on, and it's been good to be back after 3 years, so thank you for that. Again, just think about it. There's a good chance it's going to happen, unfortunately. And I think to what Darryl had mentioned earlier, it's really around how you react. Some things aren't stoppable. State sponsored are going to get in. So you just have to think about what do you do when this actually happens? Because there's a good chance it's going to happen, unfortunately. So just think through it, make sure you have a plan at some level, but you have the initial plan and you think about who you're going to call when it does happen. So there's my thoughts. Darryl, what do you think?
Well, and then your team, whether this team is external, like whether we're your team for incident response or you have an internal team, the difference between really good and really bad incidents are, does everybody know what is expected of them and who does what and when do they do it? And just, it's a muscle memory thing. And, unless you're one of these certain hotels that's in the business of being hacked every month and stuff, you just don't go through it. And so to Ernie's point, yes, the plan needs to be there. And the plan needs to be something that you can follow. I've unfortunately seen this in litigation. When it comes down to the litigation, that's the first thing that the lawsuits target are. Let's see your incident response plan, and it says number 1, I'll call Ernie, and they didn't call Ernie, and number 2, I'll do this, and they didn't do that, and so they couldn't even follow their own plan. And so the plan has to be very custom to what your team is capable of doing, and don't overstate. I see all of them on step 3. It says eradicate the malware, and that's it. There's how do you know and validate that? The train team is probably, whether that team is an outside team like us, where we're integrated with your team and you've already been onboarded, or you have an internal team, just everybody being trained and what's going to be expected of them that first week or so during an incident.
Thank you.
Very, very good advice. Yeah, thank you guys. Really appreciate having you guys on, and you're about to kick off your day, so really appreciate the time there, and hopefully we're not keeping you too long from your coffee. Nick, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us as well, and yeah, we'll catch everyone on the next episode.